The rain comes down different in the Appalachians. It does not just fall, it seeps into wood and memory, into houses that should have fallen decades ago, but somehow still stand with their doors half open, waiting. Tonight, we are going back inside those places. You are watching Black Pine Archives. What you are about to hear are 9 documented accounts from abandoned house explorations in the Appalachian region. Some of them come from police reports and call logs. Some come from camera footage that was never meant for anyone outside a small circle of friends. All of them happened in homes that should have been empty. If you want more true disturbing stories dug up from places most people drive past, with their windows locked, make sure you subscribe to Black Pine Archives and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next file we pull from the dark. Now, settle in. The houses have been waiting a long time. Let us begin. The farmhouse sat on a low rise above the gravel road, its roofline sagging like a tired shoulder. County records listed it as unoccupied for roughly 20 years. There was no active utility account, no recent meter readings, no well permit filed since the early 1990s. Tax payments had stopped almost a decade earlier, and the property had drifted quietly into bureaucratic limbo. For most people, it would have remained a parcel number in an aging binder. For a certain kind of urban explorer, the ones who traded locations in encrypted group chats and measured weekends in abandoned square footage, it became a destination. 2 friends made the drive on a cool autumn afternoon, the kind of gray day when the hills trapped mist in their folds, and the air smelled of leaf rot and wood smoke from distant hollows. They parked at the end of a rutted track choked with goldenrod and blackberry cane, killed the engine and let the silence close around them before shouldering tripods and cameras. The first minutes of their footage looked like dozens of other explorations. Exterior pan, overgrown yard, a porch that flexed under their weight. The front door stood half open, its paint blistered and flaking. The deadbolt locked in a position that no longer mattered because the jamb had rotted away. Inside, the house matched the profile of a long Appalachian abandonment. Floral wallpaper peeled off in long, curling sheets. A couch had slumped in the middle, its springs visible through torn upholstery. A rotary phone lay face down beside a nest of brittle envelopes, their stamps showing old postal rates. Magazines from the early 1990s were fanned across a low table, freeze-framing a world that no longer existed. Nothing in those first rooms suggested anyone had crossed the threshold in years. Their route followed the same practical sequence most explorers used. Kitchen first, where mouse-eaten pantry shelves and a rusted stove confirmed the lack of recent life. The refrigerator door was wired shut, an old trick to keep scavengers out. When one of them swung it open for the camera, the shelves inside were bare. No jars, no bottles. Only a smear of mold on yellowed plastic. From there, they moved to the narrow pantry, to the living room, where family photos had been stripped from the walls, leaving pale silhouettes, and then toward the staircase. One of them paused in the hallway to film an electrical outlet hanging loose from the plaster, cloth-insulated wiring exposed like veins. On the audio track, his voice is matter-of-fact. Whole place is wired with relics. This is decades past safe. There is no way anything here is still live. From field notes recorded on camera, the bathroom was on the 2nd floor at the end of a short hallway with warped floorboards and a window that let in a muttering light through the trees. The first indication that something was out of place was not what they saw, but what the microphones heard. Under their commentary and the steady creak of the stairs, there is a low hiss on the audio, continuous and soft, like a distant highway. The nearest major road lay miles away, shielded by ridges and forest. The hiss grew slightly louder each time they climbed another step, then settled into a constant presence, a background pressure the human ear masked but the microphone preserved. They reached the landing. The bathroom door stood almost closed, paint flaked, handle tarnished. One of them put a hand on it and gave it a gentle push. The hiss thickened on the recording. The tub occupied most of the left wall. It was an old cast-iron model with a high rim and claw feet, the enamel spiderwebbed with age. The basin was half full. The water inside was cloudy with silt, but clear enough to mirror the narrow window and the line of the ceiling. There was no ring of scum, no leaf debris, no drifting insects. On video, there is no visible steam. The room looks cold, paint blisters, a cracked mirror, a towel bar hanging at an angle. One of them steps closer. The camera dips as he kneels and reaches out. He does not speak in that moment. His reaction comes later, in a separate clip recorded back at the car while his hands still shake. My fingers came out pink. It was just below hot, like bathwater when you wait too long to get in. It felt like someone had shut it off a few minutes before we got there. From a post-incident recording in the bathroom footage itself, his hand hovers in frame above the surface and withdraws. The other explorer swings the camera toward the faucet, testing explanations. Both handles turn freely with a dry, grinding sound. No pressure, no trickle, no vibration in the pipes. Beneath the house, weeks later, a plumbing inspector will lie on his back in the dirt and trace the copper lines with a flashlight, only to find them ending in jagged cuts. Open to air, nowhere near a wellhead. On the cracked tile floor, dust lies in a thin gray film, interrupted by footprints. Bare, narrow, the kind a small adult or older child might leave stepping from the tub. The impressions are not dusty outlines, but damp darkenings, each toe and arch pressed clearly into the grime, where moisture has soaked in. The prints lead away from the tub, across the tiles and toward the far wall. The camera follows, adjusting focus as it moves. The wall gives nothing obvious back. Faded wallpaper in a dated pattern. A towel rack with one bracket missing. No door, no evidence of a patch or sealed frame. No closet or built-in structure that would explain traffic to that spot. The prints stop at the baseboard. The last one is slightly smeared, as if the heel had twisted or the person had shifted their weight, preparing to step into something beyond the plane of the wall. The dampness there is freshest, edges soft, already wicking outward into the dust. In later commentary, one of the explorers tries to articulate the sensation of standing in that room. It was like walking in on a shower right after somebody wrapped a towel around themselves and stepped into the next room. Only there was no next room. Just old paint and silence. From a written statement, their behavior changes noticeably on camera. After that discovery, their jokes dry up. The lens work becomes jerky, utilitarian. They stop narrating small details. The rest of the house tour takes less than 10 minutes, their footsteps quick and unsteady. Outside, they do not linger for exterior shots. The closing clip of their raw footage is a brief, swung-around view of the farmhouse, receding in the rear window as gravel rattles under the tires. The official record begins later. The property owner received a message from one of the explorers, framed as a courtesy call about trespass and possible liability. He requested that a deputy accompany him to inspect for damage. They went out on a dry afternoon 3 days after the exploration. By then, the weather had shifted. The air inside the house felt colder than outside. Dust lay undisturbed over the floors. Their boots left the only visible prints in most rooms. The deputy's body camera captured the climb up the stairs, the hall, the bathroom door. He commented once on the smell, a flat, stale scent of old plaster and rodent nests. The bathroom, when they opened it, matched the age of the rest of the house. The tub was empty. A crusted orange ring clung to its sides where water had once sat for years and slowly evaporated. The enamel at the drain was chipped and blackened with rust. No fresh dampness streaked the walls. The mirror held only their reflections. The floor tiles were coated with an even layer of dust. There were no bare footprints, no smudges, only their own prints beginning to mar the surface as they stepped inside. The deputy noted the discrepancy between the explorer's footage, which he had reviewed in clipped segments, and what he was seeing in front of him. Subject video depicts standing water in second-floor tub and recent wet foot impressions on adjacent floor. On-site inspection revealed dry basin with long-standing mineral staining and no visible footprints other than those made during current visit. From a supplemental report out of professional habit, he checked behind the toilet, under the sink, and inside the cabinet above. No leaks, no dampness. Curious, and at the owner's request, he crawled into the low space under the house to look at the plumbing. His own written account is blunt. The copper supply line intended to feed the upstairs bathroom terminates in open air in the crawl space. Pipes are dry and occluded with corrosion and debris. No evidence of recent flow. There is no connection to any active well or municipal source. From an investigator's notes, by that point, the story had already begun to circulate in town in a less clinical form. The footage passed between friends. Details blurred, condensed, grew. Archive transition. The farmhouse has since been posted, its windows boarded and bright warning signs nailed to the porch posts. Even so, hunters crossing the backfield in late season say that on certain cold mornings when their breath hangs white and the frost has not yet burned off the grass, a thin trail of fog can be seen curling out of the second-floor bathroom window, as if the house is still trying to vent someone else's heat. The house sat on a shallow slope above a two-lane road, half hidden by sumac and young pines that had grown unchecked since the last time anyone trimmed the yard. The foundation was exposed along the downhill side, cinder blocks flaking from years of freeze-thaw cycles. County records listed the address as unoccupied since a fire took the kitchen roughly 15 years earlier. The upper floors had been repaired just enough to keep the roof from collapsing immediately, but never enough to make the structure livable again. The basement, according to the same records, had never been remediated, cleared, or formally inspected. It was the kind of place that attracted explorers who wanted something believable, something that still carried the shape of ordinary life, even after it had been abandoned. 3 friends arrived at dusk on an early winter evening when daylight faded fast and the woods turned into a single dark mass behind the house. They parked out of sight on a side shoulder, moved quietly over dead leaves, and filmed an exterior pass for context. Their lights swept across warped siding, smoke-stained window frames, and a front porch that sagged at the left corner like it had been stepped on too many times in the past. The upstairs rooms matched what the fire reports hinted at. Char on studs, a ceiling with a black bloom spreading outward from where flames once traveled, cabinets stripped of doors, the smell of old soot that never fully left. The air was dry and stale, carrying that specific combination of ash and mouse droppings that settled into porous wood. Their footage from the main floor sounded confident, even playful in that practiced way content creators learned to adopt. They filmed like professionals and breathed like amateurs, the kind of breathing that came from trying not to acknowledge how quiet an abandoned place truly was. The basement door was in the back hall. It was a simple wooden door, paint cracked, hinges rusted, latch loose. When they pulled it open, a draft of colder air rose from below, not dramatic but steady, as if the house was ventilating itself through a lung in its lowest level. A concrete stairwell dropped into shadow under a low ceiling. The walls were unfinished. There were spider webs stitched from stud to stud, like thin gray gauze. They moved down cautiously, one at a time. Lights angled toward the steps. The basement was not cinematic. It was not arranged like a ritual scene. It looked like a place where someone once stored their overflow and then never returned. Old canning shelves lined one wall, mostly empty except for a few glass jars that had turned opaque with mineral film. A rusted water heater leaned slightly off-center, its pipes capped. The concrete floor was bare except for scattered debris, a few broken boards, and a dark stain in the far corner that could have been water damage from the fire years ago. No chains, no cages, no writing on the walls. No obvious explanation for why the house had become a local rumor. They made a slow circuit, sweeping their beams across the corners and joists, filming the ceiling for signs of animals. Their eyes stayed on what light revealed. Their brains did what brains always did in places like that. They filled in the rest with assumptions. What they did not notice in the moment was what the microphones recorded. The audio track from that first walkthrough carried a faint sound directly behind the lead explorer's voice. It was subtle enough to be dismissed as wind at first, or the movement of clothing. But when the clip was played back later in a quiet room, it separated itself from the rest of the noise. A slow inhale, a slightly longer exhale, not the breath of someone holding a camera, not the rhythm of footsteps on concrete. It sounded too close, as if it was being made within arm's length of the microphone. Beneath it, there was a soft brush of fabric against something, and a tiny click like a zipper tooth bumping hard plastic. They listened to it several times, each repetition making it harder to pretend it was nothing. We were talking about mold, and under my voice you can hear it, right next to the camera, breathing like somebody was pressed against my shoulder. From a later statement, the sound grew clearer in the final seconds of the clip, right as their light swept toward the far corner where the stain darkened the floor. Then the file cut into a brief burst of white noise, the kind caused by corrupted recording, and ended abruptly. They told themselves it was interference, or a glitch, or one of their own breaths layered strangely. They used every rational explanation available because that was what kept people functional. By morning, the rational explanations were no longer enough. They returned the next day to prove it to themselves. Same road, same pull-off, same house. The light was different, colder and flatter in daytime. The structure looked smaller without the cover of dusk. More obviously ruined, less like a mystery and more like a hazard. They filmed the approach again, mostly for continuity. Their movements were tighter now, less casual. They spoke less. They listened more. The basement door opened with the same loose grind. The concrete steps dropped into the same shadow. Halfway down the stairs, they stopped. A thin line of table salt ran from wall to wall across the treads. Not scattered, not spilled, not clumped like it had been tossed. It was laid in a deliberate band, even in thickness, as if poured slowly by a steady hand. Their footage from the day before clearly showed the stairs coated with dust and grit, uninterrupted. There had been no salt. There had been nothing white on the steps at all. The salt line sat on the third and fourth step like an instruction. It made the air feel different even before they reached it. The basement smelled heavier, damp in a way it had not the previous evening, as if the space had absorbed moisture overnight and held it. Their lights revealed no water source and no dripping pipes. The concrete looked dry, yet the smell suggested something had recently changed. A maintenance contractor who later visited the property with the owner for structural assessment wrote a short note after hearing the story and checking the stairs himself. Fresh salt line observed across the mid-stair treads. No evidence of prior application or disturbance consistent with a spill. From a maintenance log, they did not cross the line. It was not a decision made through logic so much as a refusal that rose intact and immediate, the way a hand pulls back from a hot surface before the mind catches up. Each of them later described the same sensation, a clear internal signal that the boundary meant something, even if none of them could explain why. They backed up the steps, keeping their lights on the salt, watching for movement that never came. The basement remained still. No footsteps, no shifting shadows, only the low, steady sense of a space that felt occupied without showing an occupant. They left without filming a second walkthrough. The footage shows only their retreat up the stairs, the camera angle tilted slightly too high, as if the person holding it could not bring himself to point it downward again. That night, they listened to the original audio a final time, with the memory of the salt line in their minds. The breathing on the tape sounded less like interference and more like a presence pacing them. The inhale sharpened as their light neared the far corner. The exhale lengthened as if it was meant to be heard. In the last usable second before the file glitched into static, the breathing changed. It shifted from a passive rhythm into a controlled movement of air, low and almost conversational, like someone preparing to speak directly into a microphone. No one in the footage remembered saying anything at that moment. I can hear it change at the end, like it is about to whisper and the recording cuts before it does. From a private voice memo archive transition, the house eventually collapsed under snow load and neglect, its basement filling with runoff and broken boards. Any salt that remained would have dissolved long ago. The breathing on the recording did not dissolve. It stayed intact in the file, steady and close, waiting at the edge of the sound like something still standing behind the camera. The farmhouse had carried its reputation the way old timber carried smoke. Not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to mistake once it settled in the mind. Local kids treated it like a dare. Hunters treated it like a boundary. The story changed depending on who told it, but the shape stayed the same. A family who left in a hurry, an accident that never made the papers, and a second-floor bedroom that people described with a careful vagueness reserved for things they did not want to name. County records listed the parcel as inactive for decades. The utility provider had no active service address on file for the structure, no meter, no disconnection date in living memory, because there was nothing to disconnect. The company later confirmed it in writing after the incident, stating that no power had been supplied to that location in the current century. That was why the light should not have been there. 2 explorers arrived just after sunset, on a cold, wet evening when the hills held mist in their folds and the tree line looked stitched together by fog. They parked at the edge of a logging spur and walked in with cameras mounted and headlamps off, relying on small handheld lights to keep their presence narrow and controlled. The yard was overgrown and soft underfoot. The porch sagged slightly at the center. Windows stared back as black rectangles. Then one of them looked up. A single second-floor window held a rectangle of pure white, steady and unmoving. It did not flicker like firelight. It did not glow warm like an old incandescent bulb. It was clean and even, the color of a hospital corridor at midnight, so bright it made the surrounding darkness seem thicker by comparison. The footage captured the moment their pace changed. Their steps shortened, their shoulders tightened. The camera kept drifting back up to that window as if the lens could not stop checking whether the light was still there. They entered through a back door that had already been compromised by weather and time. The house smelled of wet plaster, animal nests, and the sour mineral odor of old rot. Floors complained under their weight, not loudly, but in a way that suggested each board had learned how to warn the house when something living moved through it. Their lights swept rooms that looked stripped and exhausted. The kitchen held no appliances. The walls showed no recent repairs. There were gaps where wiring should have been torn out long ago. No breaker panel, no conduit. The kind of absence that was not a failure, but a deliberate removal. They climbed the stairs, staying close to the wall where the treads felt more stable. The light did not spill out into the hallway the way normal light did. It seemed to stop at the closed door of the upstairs room like it had been pressed flat against the wood. The rest of the corridor remained dim under their flashlights, but the crack beneath the door held a pale seam, bright enough to outline dust on the floorboards. The door was closed. The moment the knob turned looked ordinary on video. A hand, a latch, a slow inward swing. The ordinary part lasted only as long as the door moved. Inside, the room did not behave like a room with a lamp. The ceiling fixture was empty. No bulb, no shade, no extension cord, no battery lantern on the floor. Yet the air itself appeared illuminated in a flat, shadowless way, as if the light did not originate from a point, but existed everywhere at once. Corners did not darken, objects did not cast normal silhouettes. Even the explorer's hands looked wrong in the beam, flattened as if depth had been removed from the space. It did not cast normal shadows. Even my own hand looked flat, like the room was trying to erase depth. From a personal message sent afterward, the floor was covered in clear plastic sheeting taped at the edges, stretched tight enough to crease where it met nails and splinters. The plastic was clean. Not spotless, but clean in a way that did not match the rest of the house. In one corner sat a folding metal table, its legs wrapped at the bottom with something like protective film. On the tabletop were unopened boxes of nitrile gloves, individually wrapped surgical masks, and a stack of white paper gowns still compressed in factory folds. Nothing was dusty. Nothing was yellowed. Elastic straps still held their shape. Near the door, boot prints crossed the plastic. Wide, consistent, and modern. The pattern repeated with the precision of someone who had walked slowly, heel to toe, careful not to wrinkle the plastic. The prints went from the threshold to the table and back again, and then stopped, as if the person had either stepped off the plastic into the air or left without touching the floor. The explorers filmed the edges of the room, searching for something that could explain the light. A hidden generator, a battery pack, a portable LED panel. They opened closets and found nothing but bare studs. They checked the window frame and found no wiring. They tilted the camera up at the ceiling fixture and recorded the empty socket, the absence of any filament or power source. The strangest detail was the quiet. Not the normal quiet of an abandoned house, which still held wind and settling and small animal movement, but a quiet that felt buffered, as if the room had been insulated from the rest of the world. Their footsteps on plastic sounded dampened. The camera's microphone picked up less ambient noise than it should have, as if the light itself carried a pressure that pushed sound down. They did not stay long. The footage showed them backing out instead of turning around, the way people left a space when they did not want to offer it their backs. In the hallway, the light still did not spill beyond the doorframe. It stayed contained, perfectly obedient to the room, which made it feel less like a natural phenomenon and more like a controlled condition. Outside, they tried to document the house from the yard again, aiming up at the same window for proof. The rectangle of white remained steady. The camera sensor struggled and adjusted exposure repeatedly, making the rest of the frame darken while the window held its glare. They contacted local law enforcement within hours, framing the report as a possible illegal operation. Something medical, something staged, something that did not want attention. A deputy arrived later that night and made his own notes under the porch light of his cruiser. He walked the same path through the house, photographed the room, and inspected the supplies for expiration markings. The boxes appeared new. The packaging was intact. The deputy recorded the boot prints and attempted to locate any matching track outside in the yard. There were none. In his report, he described the scene in restrained language that avoided conclusions. Second floor room observed with bright white illumination, no power source identified. Evidence of recent use included clean medical supplies and boot impressions on intact plastic. No occupants located on entry. From a deputy's report, the utility provider was contacted the next day. Their reply, later added to the case file, stated that no active electrical service existed for the address and that the nearest service line did not extend to the structure. The house, on paper, should have been unable to support a lit room. The deputy returned with additional personnel shortly afterward, expecting to secure evidence, document any trespass, and determine whether the property had been used for something criminal. They approached during daylight, when the house looked dull and harmless, more ruin than threat. The upstairs window was dark. Inside, the second-floor room had changed. The plastic sheeting was gone. The folding table was gone. The taped edges remained only as faint adhesive ghosts on the floorboards, thin lines of residue that suggested the plastic had been peeled up carefully rather than ripped away. The room smelled like old wood and damp insulation, nothing sterile, nothing medical. There were no boot prints, no supplies, only a pale rectangle on the floor where something had blocked dust and light, leaving a cleaner patch behind. No wiring appeared, no new holes, no altered panel. The ceiling fixture remained empty. A follow-up inspection of the crawl space and exterior walls found no generator footprint and no fuel residue. The yard showed no tire ruts consistent with recent unloading, no dragged marks, no broken brush. The house had hosted a sterile zone and then returned to abandonment, like a face returning to neutral after a brief expression. One of the explorers tried to frame the most unsettling part in a private audio note, recorded later in a car with the doors locked. The supplies looked staged for use, not for storage. It felt like arriving late to an active room that did not want witnesses. From a post-incident voice memo, the case file ended the way many rural anomalies ended, with paperwork, uncertainty, and no next step that could be justified. The property owner boarded the lower windows. Trespassing signs appeared. The sheriff's office advised neighbors to report vehicles on the spur road. Nothing in the official record explained where the light came from, why it stayed confined to a single room, or why it vanished without leaving a trail. Archive transition. No one in the county medical community admitted to using the farmhouse, and no contractor claimed responsibility for the materials. Still, on certain nights when fog sat low along the ridge, a few residents reported seeing a single square of white light bloom in the second-floor window for less than a minute, steady and clinical, before the house returned to darkness, as if nothing had happened at all. The rumor had started the way most rural rumors did, with a place name that sounded like a joke until it didn't. The Camera House, a sagging structure on a narrow gravel road that followed a creek through a fold of Appalachia, where the trees grew tight and the shoulders fell away into dark water. People who lived nearby never gave a precise address. They only said it was easy to miss if the fog was down and impossible to forget if you stopped. 3 explorers chose it on a weekend run in late spring, the kind of trip they treated like a routine. They filmed abandoned barns, photographed rusted farm equipment, and logged each location in a private map they kept off public posts. The Camera House was supposed to be a break from the usual rot and raccoon nests, a place that might offer a story with sharper edges. They parked their red compact at a pull-off wide enough for one vehicle, its right tail light cracked and held together with clear tape, a small sticker on the rear window that made it easy to spot in footage. The creek ran loud behind the tree line, and the road carried no other traffic for the first half hour they were there. Their cameras captured the usual approach. Mud on boots, careful steps, a quick check for recent squatters. The house looked like it had been losing a fight with weather for years. The porch sagged, the siding peeled back in long strips. The front windows were broken out, leaving jagged glass teeth in the frames. Nothing about the exterior suggested surveillance. No visible trail cameras, no fresh padlocks, no warning signs. The first rooms carried the expected smell of plaster dust, animal droppings, and wet wood. Floorboards felt soft underfoot, and the air had that stale taste that came from structures that had not been heated in a long time. They moved room to room in a predictable pattern: kitchen, back hall, a narrow staircase that they chose not to climb because the railing shifted under a light grip. Then the living room. The wall was already waiting for them. It began at chest height and climbed almost to the ceiling, a grid of modern glossy prints held in place by strips of transparent tape that still looked new. The paper was too bright for the room, too clean for the air. In the beam of their lights, the photos gleamed as if they had been mounted recently after the last heavy dustfall. Every print showed the same car, their car. At first, the mind tried to soften the hit. A coincidence, a similar model, a local vehicle, but the cracked tail light appeared in every frame. The sticker sat in the same place. One photo caught the passenger side mirror with a scuff shaped like a comma. Another captured a dent near the rear wheel well that none of them ever remembered to fix. The images had variety that made them worse. Different angles, different distances, different lighting. Some shots were taken low, as if from a crouch behind another car door. Others came from above, as if from a second-story window or a hillside. A few were distant enough to require zoom, the kind that compressed space and made the car look pinned against its background like an insect. The oldest prints on the wall showed the car at a gas station 2 counties away. In the background, a digital sign advertised a discounted price that had changed within the last month, a detail that anchored the image to recent time rather than the long-dead history of the house. Another photo showed the car at a rest stop, the sky in that frame a washed-out gray that matched the weather they remembered from a morning drive. Another showed the car parked on a small-town main street under a posted restriction sign, the print sharp enough to catch the town name on a nearby storefront. None of the three recalled seeing anyone with a camera. None of the three recalled hearing another engine. The wall did not feel like a prank. It felt like an archive created by someone who had been close enough to watch them load gear, close enough to follow them through ordinary stops, close enough to anticipate where they would go next. Someone had been close enough to watch us load our bags and never made a sound. The oldest photo on that wall was from 3 weeks ago. From a personal log entry, they began checking the prints for patterns the way anxious minds did when faced with something that refused to be explained. They counted locations. They searched for timestamps embedded in background screens and receipts and roadside signage. The sequence wasn't random. It moved like a trail. Gas station, grocery lot, trailhead, motel, rest stop, county pull-off, another trailhead, another motel, a route, a map made out of photographs. Near the center of the wall was the image that changed their breathing. Their red compact sat on the shoulder directly in front of the same house they were standing in, angled exactly the way they had parked it moments earlier. The perspective was wrong for a ground-level shot. It looked like it had been taken from above, from a height that suggested an upstairs window. The photo contained one additional detail that none of them could dismiss. A human silhouette stood at the edge of the porch, half in frame, posture matching one of them so closely it felt like a mirror that had been placed in the past. The outline showed the same jacket shape, the same stance, the same slight forward lean of someone looking into a dark room. The problem was that they had not yet entered the house when they arrived. The porch had been empty. Their own cameras had been running, and no one had been positioned across the road to take that shot. No one had walked past them. No one had moved in the brush. They looked up at the ceiling and began searching for the mechanical comfort of an explanation. A hidden camera, a pinhole lens, a trail cam tucked into a corner. The ceiling plaster held stains and cracks, and one spot near the corner that looked slightly different, as if it had been patched and repainted at some point long after the rest of the room had been abandoned. Their lights found a tiny irregularity there, not much larger than a pencil eraser, dark against lighter plaster. They did not have the tools to open the ceiling. They did not climb a ladder. They did not stay long enough to test the theory. They did something more human. They backed away from the wall and listened. The house had gone quiet in a way that made their own movement feel louder than it should have. No creak noise through the broken windows, no birds, no wind pushing through the trees. Their camera microphones captured the shift as a sudden flattening of ambient sound, like a hand had closed over the world outside. They left the living room without finishing their sweep of the property. On the way out, they checked the back rooms again for signs of a recent occupant. No bedding, no food wrappers, no cigarette smell, no fresh boot prints in dust. Outside, the air felt colder than it had when they arrived. Their car waited where they had left it. Then they saw the paper tucked under the driver's side wiper, a single new glossy print, still stiff, edges crisp, ink fresh enough to hold a faint chemical odor when one of them lifted it. It showed the three of them standing in the living room, heads tilted up at the wall, the moment frozen with uncomfortable precision. The angle matched that ceiling corner. The lighting in the photo was not the harsh beam of their flashlights. It looked even and clean, as if the room had been illuminated from above. The print had no message on the back, no handwriting, no explanation, only proof. We left in a hurry, and when we got to the car, there was a photo of us inside the house. It felt like the house had printed it for us. From a post-incident audio note, they reported the incident the way people did when they wanted a paper trail but did not expect to be believed. They framed it as possible stalking, illegal surveillance, trespass, anything that fit into existing categories. The local sheriff's office agreed to send a deputy to document the property. The deputy arrived the next day with two priorities that had nothing to do with the supernatural. Identify any evidence of criminal harassment. Determine whether the explorers had tampered with the scene. Establish chain of custody for the print left on the windshield. In daylight, the living room wall looked even more wrong. The tape strips were still clear and fresh, pressed flat without dust clinging to the adhesive. The photos had been printed on the same general size, but subtle differences in color balance and sharpness suggested multiple consumer devices or multiple camera sources. Some images carried a cooler cast, others warmer. A few showed compression artifacts consistent with phone cameras. Others looked like point-and-shoot prints. All of them, however, appeared to have been printed on the same model of home printer, the same glossy stock. The deputy photographed the wall, bagged several prints as evidence, and attempted to pull fingerprints from the tape and paper surfaces. Nothing usable came back from those specific areas. The technician noted prints elsewhere in the structure, but they were old and degraded, smeared by time, not helpful for identifying a recent handler. No fingerprints recovered from photo surfaces or tape. Prints present elsewhere in structure were old and degraded. From evidence notes, the deputy also inspected the ceiling corner where the explorers believed a lens could have been hidden. He noted the patch discoloration. He noted the small, irregular dark spot. He did not open the ceiling, citing safety concerns due to unstable flooring and the risk of collapse. He did, however, record one detail that supported the explorers' fear in a quiet, procedural way. The photo left under the wiper showed a viewpoint consistent with that ceiling corner, not with any angle a person could easily achieve, in the room without being seen. The house had produced an image from a place no one should have been able to occupy. That conclusion did not fit neatly into a report, so it sat between lines as implication. The explorers stopped posting location-based content after that. They did not return to the Creek Road. They did not speak publicly about the wall beyond a vague warning to other explorers. In private, they began noticing smaller echoes. A car that seemed to appear in the same rear-view position too many times on long drives, a phone notification that arrived with no sender, a camera roll image that appeared blurred and unusable, except for the unmistakable red shape of their compact in the background. Less than a month later, the house burned. The fire was reported after midnight by a neighbor who saw an orange pulse through the trees and assumed lightning had struck. When responders arrived, the living room was already consumed. The upstairs collapsed early. No one was found inside. No accelerant was detected in the ash. The origin point was listed as the living room, a detail that made its way into quiet conversation, even among those who did not believe the explorer's story. Neighbors reported no vehicles leaving the scene. The wall, if it existed as described, was destroyed. The prints became ash. The tape became smoke. Only one photograph remained in evidence, the one left under the windshield wiper, sealed in a bag that still held a faint printer smell months later, as if it refused to age at the same pace as ordinary paper. Archive transition. The creek road continued to collect mist in the mornings, and the pull-off remained just wide enough for one vehicle. Locals stopped using the name Camera House after the fire, but the rumor did not die. It only changed shape. People began warning each other about a place where the woods did not just watch, but remembered, and where proof appeared after the fact. Already printed, already waiting, as if the act of being seen had become the only kind of trespass that mattered. The house sat too close to the road to feel like a secret. It was one of those Appalachian abandonments that had never been swallowed by deep woods, only left behind by money and time. In winter, trucks threw salt and grit that ate at the foundation. In summer, tourists slowed to stare at the sagging porch and the front door that still hung straight enough to open. That front door was why explorers liked it. It made the place feel safe in a way abandoned houses never were. A working door implied simple rules: enter, walk through, leave. It suggested the structure still understood what people were supposed to do inside it. Two explorers arrived on a rain-slick afternoon in early spring, the kind of day when the skies stayed low and the road shone like black glass. They parked in a gravel turnout and filmed their approach with routine confidence. The footage caught the usual details: wet weeds pushing through cracked concrete, a porch railing soft enough to flex under a light touch, old mail scattered near the entry in a damp heap that had fused into paper pulp. Inside, the air smelled of water-stained plaster and the sweet, sour rot of saturated wood. Their lights moved through wallpaper that had bubbled and peeled. A television sat in the living room with its screen smashed inward, as if something had been thrown from the inside out. Curtains stirred in broken window frames, not from a strong wind, but from a steady draft that felt like the house exhaling. They moved methodically, narrating for their own records without speaking in a way that would sound like a conversation later. Each room received the same sweep of light. Each doorway was checked for soft flooring. Each corner was examined for signs of squatters. There were no blankets, no bottles, no recent footprints in the dust. Nothing that suggested anyone had been there in the last several weeks. The interior room was off the main hall, narrow and windowless, the kind of space that might once have been a study or a storage closet. Its door was plain, painted and repainted until the edges had rounded. The explorers stepped inside because it felt like a simple box to document and move on from. Shelves sagged against one wall. Plaster fragments lay like snow in the corners. The air inside was warmer than the rest of the house by a degree or two, enough to be noticeable when rain had soaked everything else. On their camera audio, the first strange sound appeared during a slow pan across the shelves. It was not subtle. A heavy thud came from the hall, followed by a faint scrape like wood dragged across old boards. The door began to swing inward. At first it looked like a draft catching it, a common thing in a building with broken windows. The door did not slam. It moved in a controlled arc as if guided. It drifted until the latch kissed the frame and held. The explorers paused, then approached the handle with the mild irritation of people who had dealt with stubborn doors before. One hand turned the knob. The door opened a few inches, then stopped with a solid impact that did not match swollen wood. The camera angle changed as they repositioned it to see the gap and the hall beyond. Their lights spilled into the hallway, and the threshold gap showed a new darkness cutting across that light. Two vertical bars aligned exactly where chair legs would stand if a chair had been braced beneath the knob. Then the shadow at the bottom shifted. For less than a second, the outline of feet interrupted the light under the door. Not shoes, not boots, but bare shapes that looked too smooth to be socks and too still to be dust patterns. The shadow moved out of frame without any corresponding footstep sound. Their breathing changed. The camera picked it up as a shallow, controlled rhythm that suggested panic being held down by discipline. The door resisted again when they pushed, pressing back against their shoulders with a slow firmness, like pressure applied from the other side. They tried to force it without breaking it. That choice mattered later, because it meant the door and frame remained intact as evidence. The knob rattled, the hinges creaked, the latch held. The only sound from the hall was the rain and the low moan of wind passing broken panes. One of them recorded a short note on a phone while the camera continued to run. Something put that chair there while we were filming. We would have heard footsteps, but there was just that one bang, and then nothing. From an audio note, minutes passed in that small room. They tested the door in careful cycles, pushing and releasing, listening for any change in pressure. They watched the gap for movement. They angled their lights to catch any shift in shadow. The house remained quiet in a way that made the silence feel intentional. Then the resistance released. There was no gradual easing, no creak of wood sliding away. The door simply gave up all at once and swung open hard enough to bump the wall outside. Their lights flooded the hallway. There was no chair under the knob. There was no chair anywhere near the door. The dust on the board showed only their own boot prints and a few older, softened impressions that could have been years old. The hall looked exactly as it had a few minutes earlier, as if nothing had moved. They stepped out slowly, scanning left and right. Their camera caught the emptiness of the corridor in long, unsteady frames. The only thing that looked different was the dust itself, just outside the room. A faint arc cut through it in a shallow curve, as if something rounded had been dragged slowly under weight. They left the house without finishing the remaining rooms. Outside, the rain had intensified. The road hissed with passing tires. Their car sat where they had left it, windows beaded with water. Their footage captured a final detail. As they crossed the porch, the front door behind them swung gently shut and settled into its frame without slamming, not pushed by a gust, not pulled by gravity. The knob turned a fraction of an inch on its own, and then stilled. Days later, a building inspector entered with a different goal: check structural risk for a planned road widening project. He found the interior room intact and empty. He found no movable furniture that could have been used as an obstruction. He noted the dust arc outside the door and described it in cautious, dry language. No movable furniture present on second inspection. Arc pattern in dust, consistent with recent obstruction under door hardware. From an inspection summary, the inspector did not note any footprints that did not belong to him. The absence became the point. Something had blocked the door without leaving a chair behind. Something had stood close enough to cast a shadow and then stepped away without making a sound. The house had performed the smallest possible act of control, a simple lesson delivered with no theatrics. Leaving was allowed only when the house decided it was. Archive transition. The property was acquired during a road project, and the house was demolished about a year later. The interior room that had trapped them was already structurally compromised, and the crew removed it with machines, not hands. Even then, workers reported an odd delay on that section. a jam that forced them to stop and reposition equipment twice, as if the remaining walls refused to come down on schedule. The county records treated the house like a slow problem, a small clapboard structure on a back road, assessed value dropping each year, tax bill rising, notices mailed to an address that no longer mattered. The last owner had died in a nursing home with no listed heirs. After that, the place became a gap in the system, a parcel that existed on paper while vines and weather did whatever they wanted to the wood. By the time explorers reached it, the porch had been braided over by creepers. Saplings had rooted in the gutters and bent them outward under their weight. The front steps held a permanent slick of moss that turned each footfall into a cautious test. The house looked like hundreds of others in that part of Appalachia, left behind, slowly softened at the edges, a structure becoming landscape. Inside, the air felt heavier than the house justified. The ceiling sagged. The kitchen smelled like mold and sweet rot. Old food jars stood on a counter with their labels melted into brown stains. A calendar in the hall had been open to a month that meant nothing now, its paper buckled by humidity. Most rooms showed the usual story of abandonment: water damage, animal nesting, furniture collapsed into itself. The small back bedroom was different. It looked almost intact in a way that made the intactness feel staged. The wallpaper still clung to the walls, though its pattern had faded into a bruise of pastel balloons and clouds. A narrow bed frame leaned against one wall, its springs exposed. A small dresser sat crooked but upright. The floor was bare wood, dusty but not deeply layered with debris, and scattered across that floor were toys: a doll with a bitten cheek, wooden blocks, a small plastic truck the color of old butter, a stuffed animal flattened by time, one ear torn, its sewn-on eyes still glossy under the light. None of it was unusual by itself. The arrangement was. Every toy with a face had been turned to point toward the same corner of the room, not knocked that way by chance, not angled roughly in that direction, deliberately oriented like someone had used both hands to set each object precisely where it could watch. Dolls stared, the truck's molded windshield aimed forward. The stuffed animal's head had been rotated until its stitched mouth faced the corner with the others. Even the blocks, where one side carried painted letters, had been arranged so those letters faced the same point. The corner they faced was subtly wrong. The wallpaper there bulged outward slightly, like damp plaster swelling, except the rest of the wall was flat. The cloud pattern stretched over that bulge in a way that made the corner look like skin pulled tight over something underneath. The explorers filmed the room longer than they filmed the rest of the house. Their lights lingered. Their steps became careful, as if they were afraid of disturbing a setup they did not understand. One of them later wrote about the feeling in a private field journal, kept separate from the public footage. It was like an audience waiting for something to start. Every toy with a face pointed at that same swollen spot. From a field journal, they approached the corner slowly and touched the wallpaper. It felt damp, but not soaked. The bulge resisted pressure like something firm behind it. They peeled at a loose seam in the paper, expecting crumbling plaster, expecting rot. Instead, the wallpaper lifted cleanly. Beneath it was not old lath or patched drywall. It was a panel cut into the wall and reattached so neatly that the seam had been hidden under the pattern. The edges were straight, the corners sharp. 4 screws held it in place, and those screws were bright. Their metal had not dulled. There was no rust bloom, no paint flecks from decades of repainting. That single detail changed the room. It introduced time where time should not have existed. It meant someone had been here recently enough to own a drill and clean screws, recently enough to care about concealment. They backed the screws out and eased the panel free. Behind it was a short, narrow shaft descending between studs. Fresh lumber lined the inside, pale wood with visible saw marks that had not been darkened by age. A metal rung had been screwed into one side, the first of what would have been a ladder if the rest had been installed. The shaft dropped farther than their light could fully confirm, but it was deep enough that the beam lost strength before it reached any obvious end. Air breathed up from the opening, colder than the room by several degrees. It carried the smell of clay and old earth and something else underneath it that made the back of the throat tighten, a mineral tang like damp stone that had never been warmed by sunlight. No electrical wiring ran into the space. No pipes, no obvious purpose. It was simply a narrow descent hidden behind a child's wallpaper. They did not climb down. Their footage shows a pause at the opening and then a slow, decisive retreat, as if instinct overrode curiosity. They filmed the shaft for evidence, then replaced the panel loosely and pressed the wallpaper back into place, knowing it would not adhere but wanting the corner to look normal again. They left the toys where they were, every face still aimed at the corner, as if the toys had already chosen their attention and would not be persuaded otherwise. Within a week, the explorers reported the hidden space to the county, partly out of concern and partly because they wanted an authority to confirm what they had found. A code enforcement officer visited and documented the room with the restrained tone of someone trained to describe even the unexplainable in plain language. Unpermitted cavity discovered behind children's bedroom wall. Depth unknown. Recent carpentry evident. From a code enforcement note, the officer planned a second visit with additional personnel to determine whether the structure posed a hazard. That second visit happened several weeks later, after weather delays and scheduling, and it produced a result that turned the house into a different kind of case. The corner had changed. The wall was continuous. The wallpaper was still bubbled in that spot, but when they peeled it back, there was no seam, no screw heads, no cut line. The drywall beneath appeared unbroken, painted over in a thin, uneven layer that looked older than any fresh repair should have looked. There were no holes where screws had been removed, no wood dust, no hint that anything had ever been installed there. The hatch was gone in the way a thing vanishes when the world rewrites itself to deny it existed. The officer documented that too, because there was nothing else to do with it. There was, however, one remaining inconsistency that no rewritten wall could erase. The toys had shifted, not scattered, not knocked over, shifted with intention. Where they had once faced the swollen corner, they now faced the doorway. Doll eyes aimed toward the threshold. The yellow truck pointed outward. The stuffed animal's head had been rotated again, now oriented toward the only exit. It looked like a room full of small witnesses waiting for someone to step inside. One of the explorers returned weeks later to confirm what the officials had seen. He stood in the doorway, filmed the toys, and recorded a short note afterward, the kind of sentence that tried to be rational and failed. They were not facing the corner anymore. They were watching the door like they had heard something coming. From a follow-up recording, the house was eventually posted with warnings and marked for future sealing. No one ever found the hatch again. No one found any crawl space access beneath the house that matched the shaft's supposed depth. No missing persons case was officially tied to the address, but the back bedroom gained a local reputation that did not need paperwork. Neighbors driving past at night began to report a low light in that room, close to the floor, steady and pale, as if it came from inside the wall rather than from a lamp. The reports were inconsistent and never captured cleanly on cameras. The light appeared, then did not. The house offered evidence only when it chose to. Archive transition. The property remained empty, foreclosure sign bleaching in sun and rain until it became unreadable. The bedroom window stayed dark most nights. On some nights, it did not, and those who saw it described the same detail every time. The glow did not sit in the room like normal light, but pressed against the wall in that corner. as if something behind the drywall was awake and testing whether it was being watched back. The farmhouse sat where an old cemetery road narrowed into a single-lane track, the kind of place drivers reached only if they were lost, curious, or looking for something that did not want to be found on a paved route. The group of explorers did not arrive with a plan to film it. They had been following weathered headstones and family plots through the trees, documenting names that had faded into lichen when the track bent and the roofline appeared between oaks. From the outside, the house looked honest in its decay. One corner of the porch had collapsed. Window glass lay in the weeds like scattered ice. The siding had peeled in long strips, exposing gray wood that smelled wet even from the yard. Nothing about it suggested recent use. Inside, the air carried the usual signatures of Appalachian abandonment: damp plaster, mouse nest, the sweet sourness of old paper gone soft at the edges. Their lights swept over empty rooms with warped floorboards and ceilings that had begun to bow. A calendar clung to a wall in the hall, its pages stuck together from humidity. A sofa had slumped into itself under a blanket of dust. The kitchen, however, resisted the pattern. The kitchen table sat centered beneath a window that still had part of its curtain, stiff with age. On that table rested a shallow bowl of apples. The fruit looked wrong in the same way a fresh footprint looks wrong on a floor that should have been undisturbed. Glossy skin, no bruises, no soft spots, no dulling at the stem. One explorer reached out and lifted an apple with 2 fingers. It felt cool, as if it had been taken from refrigeration recently. The coolness did not match the house, which was damp and cold in a different way, the cold of shade and rot rather than the cold of controlled temperature. There was no working refrigerator in the house. Their cameras picked up the empty space where one might have stood, but the only appliance present was a rusted stove with its door hanging open. They noticed the insects next, not the presence of them, but the absence. No fruit flies rose from the bowl. No gnats hovered over the table. No small drifting dots moved through their flashlight beams. The window was cracked, the doorframe had gaps, the house had openings everywhere, and yet the air around the apples remained clear and still, as if something had set rules for what could approach that table. A jar stood beside the bowl. It was a plain glass jar, half full of water, set close enough that its shadow touched the apple's shadow. A strip of masking tape had been pressed to the side, and on that tape, someone had written a date in dark marker. The date was not for that day. It was for the following day. Under it, in the same careful hand, was a first name. The name matched one of the explorers. The group did not speak much after that. Their movement became slow and procedural, as if they were trying to behave like investigators rather than trespassers who had stumbled into a staged scene. One of them photographed the label from multiple angles. Another filmed the bowl, the jar, the tabletop, then the doorway behind them, as if expecting the room to change while they were watching. Later, when they reviewed the footage, they noticed details they had not processed in the moment. The chairs around the table were not placed at random. They had been shifted recently, leaving faint drag marks through the grime on the floor. The marks curved toward the table, then stopped, as if someone had pulled out a chair, sat down, and then stood up without ever leaving footprints behind. The explorer, whose name appeared on the tape, posted a short statement online that night. After they were back in cell range and trying to convince themselves the fear was exaggeration. The water looked fresh, no dust on the rim. My own name on that tape, spelled right, even though I never told it to anyone on that trip. From a social media post, the post drew predictable responses: prank, staging, friends setting up a scare, a prop jar carried in a backpack. But the group's own timeline did not hold up cleanly, even under their skepticism. When they checked the metadata on the label photo, the timestamp showed the image had been captured 1 minute earlier, than they remembered entering the kitchen. Not 1 minute earlier than they remembered taking the photo. 1 minute earlier than they remembered crossing the threshold into the room at all. Another member documented that discrepancy in a private upload log that never went public. Our camera time said the kitchen came first. Our memory said we walked the hall and the back bedroom and then the kitchen. The file order did not match the order of our bodies. From a channel upload log, the group returned to the yard to search for a mundane explanation. They found the refrigerator then, lying on its side in weeds behind the house, door gaping open like a jaw. It had been there long enough for rust to bloom along its seams. Insects crawled inside it. The appliance was dead in every way that mattered. The apples inside the house remained cold. They did not eat them. They did not touch the jar again. They filmed the bowl, the label, the lack of insects, then backed out of the kitchen with the careful pace of people leaving a room where something unseen might be standing just out of frame. Before they left the house, one of them made a quick audio note into a phone, the kind of clipped documentation that sounded more like a report than a confession. The apples were perfect, and nothing in that place was perfect. It felt like an offering, but it also felt like bait. From an audio note recorded after exit, they reported the find to the sheriff's office as a possible squatter situation, partly out of genuine concern and partly because they wanted an official record to anchor what they had seen. A deputy arrived later that afternoon. By then, the kitchen scene had degraded in a way that made time feel unreliable. The apples had softened. Their skins had begun to pucker at the stem. The bowl held a faint sweetness in the air that attracted a small spiral of gnats near the window, as if the rules had been lifted and the normal world had been allowed back in. The jar's water had a thin film of dust on the surface, and the rim no longer looked clean. The tape label remained, but the date on it was now 2 days in the past, as if the house had moved forward faster than the road outside it. The deputy's report captured the contradiction without commentary, the way a form forces strangeness into bullet points. Perishable items in advanced aging, inconsistent with reported timeline. No other signs of habitation. From a deputy's report, he found no food caches, no bedding, no heat source, no fresh boot prints on the porch steps. In the kitchen, the dust was disturbed only where the explorers had walked. The chair drag marks were present, but there were no matching footprints around them, no evidence of a person's weight shifting, no heel pivots, no scuffs near the table legs. The deputy photographed the bowl and jar, then stepped back, as if he did not want to place his body too close to the objects. His body camera audio picked up a detail his eyes did not record. A faint, steady sound in the kitchen that rose and fell like distant airflow. It could have been wind through the window cracks. It could have been the house settling. It also resembled the kind of low mechanical hum a refrigerator makes when it cycles on. There was no refrigerator standing in the kitchen. One last detail unsettled the deputy enough that he wrote it down as a separate note rather than folding it into the general narrative. Label contained resident name, not previously known to reporting party per initial phone call. From supplemental notes, the group did not return. They stopped taking food from abandoned houses after that, even when it looked untouched, even when the hunger of a long drive made the idea briefly tempting. The apples stayed in their minds as an example of something that did not need to threaten with knives or chains to feel predatory. It only needed to offer something that looked almost kind, then prove that it knew who would reach for it. Archive transition. The bowl and jar were later removed and discarded as potential contamination hazards, and the name on the tape was never entered into the public file. In the internal case index, this incident was flagged for a single repeating anomaly, a 1-minute discrepancy that appeared again and again, in unrelated recordings from roads and houses that should not have been connected. The property did not look unusual from the road. It was one of the many Appalachian foreclosures that sat back from the pavement with a sagging porch and a mailbox leaning at a tired angle. County records listed it as bank-owned after a quiet repossession, the kind that happened when someone stopped paying and no one came to argue. The house had been empty long enough for vines to claim the steps and for squirrels to build nests in the gutters. The outbuilding was the reason the explorers came. It sat uphill behind the house, about 30 yards beyond a line of trees that grew too close together for comfort. Old aerial images showed a rectangle back there, something that had not been present in earlier decades. The group had seen it on a map layer that was not always reliable, and that unreliability became its own kind of lure. New structures did not appear behind abandoned houses without a story. They arrived in the late afternoon on a day that smelled like damp leaves and cold iron. Their tires chewed through a rutted track and left wet impressions that filled with water almost immediately. They parked in a spot where the brush opened just enough to allow a quick exit, then walked the rest of the way with cameras and headlamps, moving carefully to avoid the kind of rusted metal and broken glass that could turn a hobby into an emergency room visit. The path to the outbuilding did not look like a path at first. It looked like random disturbance in undergrowth, flattened in places, then abruptly clean again, as if traffic had been heavy and then erased. Some branches had been snapped at shoulder height, but the breaks were not old. The pale interior wood still shone beneath the bark. Their microphones captured the first warning long before their eyes accepted it. There was a faint rhythmic sound as they climbed, the soft scrape of vegetation against soil repeating in short bursts. It did not match wind. It did not match an animal moving through brush. It sounded like something being dragged and lifted without urgency. The outbuilding came into view as a lopsided box of mismatched boards and corrugated metal. Its roofline was patched with tar paper. The door hung off its hinges by a fraction, leaving a narrow black gap that leaked a colder air than the woods around it. No padlock, no chain. That absence felt deliberate, like the structure was not meant to keep people out as much as it was meant to invite them in. Inside, the smell changed immediately. Old sawdust, sharp and dry, lay underneath something metallic and sour, like a tool shed that had been closed too long after a job that should have been cleaned up. Their lights swept over a dirt floor packed hard enough to hold footprints cleanly. Nails glittered in the beams. Small scraps of wire lay like shed skin. 4 frames stood in the center of the space, arranged with a precision that made the hairs on the back of the neck rise. Each frame was roughly the size of a standing human, built from 2x4s and cross-braced boards. Slats were nailed across them in a crude grid. In places, chicken wire had been woven through the openings and then cut away, leaving sharp ends curled outward like teeth. They were cages, not display cages, not animal pens, not storage racks. The dimensions were wrong for anything but a body. The frames were narrow enough that a person inside could not turn easily, and short enough that a tall adult would have been forced to crouch. The floor inside each cage was darker than the surrounding dirt, stained by repeated contact, compacted by weight shifting in a confined space. Their camera footage showed them approaching slowly, light beams shaking slightly as they tried to keep filming steady. None of them crossed directly in front of the cage doors at first. They moved at angles as if instinct resisted standing where a trapped person might have stood and stared out. The interior surfaces told the rest of the story. Deep grooves tore through the wood from the inside. Fresh, pale scratches cut down to lighter grain beneath the darker surface, and splinters hung loose where something had tried to claw its way out. Some marks were narrow and parallel, like fingernails. Others were wider, angled, and chipped the boards as if the force behind them had been stronger than a human hand should manage against dry lumber. One explorer documented that detail later in a message sent to someone he trusted to believe him. The scratches were fresh, pale wood under dark grain. Whatever made them still had its strength when it did. From a personal email near the bottom edge of one cage, close to where ankles would have been, a smear of dried brown residue streaked across the board and vanished into the dirt. They did not test it. They did not touch it. They only filmed it and stepped back, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods had become outside the metal walls. Then they saw the drag marks. Faint grooves ran from the front of the cages toward the door, shallow lines pressed into the packed earth. They were not footprints. They were not tire tracks. They were the kind of marks left when weight was pulled rather than walked. In places, the grooves deepened as if the dragged thing had caught on uneven ground, then lifted slightly, then settled again. Halfway to the threshold, the marks stopped abruptly, not fading out, but ending as if the ground beyond had been reset. The dirt in that section looked smoother than the rest of the shed floor, brushed into a consistent texture that did not match natural disturbance. A stripped branch lay near the wall, its smaller twigs removed, its end dark with damp soil. The branch had been used like a broom. The direction of the brush strokes ran perpendicular to the drag marks, filling them in and flattening the surface with patient, repeated passes. As they filmed the branch, one of their cameras recorded a small anomaly that they would not notice until later. The timestamp jumped backward by 1 minute and then corrected itself, as if the device had hesitated over what time it was allowed to claim. Their attention stayed on the dirt and the cages until a new sound arrived. It was not a voice. It was not an animal. It was a metallic ring, faint but clean, like a tool struck lightly against metal somewhere outside the shed. It sounded 3 times, evenly spaced, then stopped. A pause followed long enough for them to listen hard. Then the same 3 rings returned, identical in timing. No one moved toward the door after that. Their footage captured a slow retreat. Lights held forward bodies backing out, as if turning their backs would give the space permission to change. Outside, the air felt warmer despite the season. The forest smelled normal again, like wet bark and leaf rot, and that normality felt like a trick. They did not run to the car at first. They walked fast, scanning the tree line, checking behind them in brief glances that never lasted long enough to confirm a silhouette. Only when the trail widened did their speed become panic. Once they reached cell service, they reported the structure as potential evidence in a missing person case. The county treated the call seriously enough to send law enforcement that same evening. A patrol unit arrived while there was still light to photograph the site, before darkness made documentation unreliable. The investigator moved with practiced restraint, treating the shed like a scene, not a curiosity. Measurements were taken, photos were logged. The cages were marked on a rough diagram. The drag marks and the brush-smoothed section of soil were recorded with close-up images that showed the difference in texture. The official notes framed the facts without committing to an explanation, but the language still carried a trace of unease. Hand-sawn confinement structures present. Interior scoring indicates forceful contact. Ground outside shows partial drag patterns obscured by recent brushing with vegetative material. From an investigator's notes, a second officer recorded a short supplemental observation that was not necessary for the report but was included anyway. Brush strokes over disturbed soil were uniform and repeated. Patterns suggested intentional concealment rather than incidental sweep. From a supplemental evidence note, cadaver dogs were requested. A larger team planned a return for the following day when there would be more personnel and better light. The area around the shed was flagged with tape, and the county attempted to secure the building with a temporary barrier that could deter casual trespass. The barrier did not last the night. When the team returned the next morning, the shed still stood. The corrugated metal still caught the same gray light. The door still leaned on its hinges at the same angle, but the interior had been emptied with a thoroughness that felt surgical. The cages were gone, not dismantled, not broken, not scattered as scrap. Gone in the way furniture disappears when it has been removed intentionally. The floor where they had stood showed only faint rectangular impressions in the dirt, as if heavy weight had been lifted straight up without shifting. The nails that had glittered the day before were fewer now, as if someone had collected them. The wire scraps were gone. The branch used as a broom was missing. The drag marks had been erased completely. The soil between the door and the center of the shed looked uniformly smoothed, brushed in long strokes that ran in different directions, creating a surface too consistent to be accidental. Only one item remained, a single bootlace near the back wall, old and frayed, pressed into the dirt as if it had been stepped on and forgotten. It did not match any boot worn by responders or the explorers. The lace was bagged, logged, and later lost in a chain of custody gap that no one could explain without admitting negligence. The cadaver dogs worked the perimeter anyway. They alerted twice near a patch of brush downhill from the shed, then lost the scent abruptly at the edge of a shallow drainage where water ran over stones. The dogs refused to cross one particular point on that drainage line, not out of training, but out of hesitation that looked like fear. Handlers documented the behavior in a report that could not translate a dog's body language into a conclusion. The case did not become an arrest. It did not become a headline. It became a file with photographs, measurements, and the memory of structures that had existed long enough to be documented and then vanished before procedure could catch up. One of the explorers tried to make sense of what they had seen by writing it down in a private log, focusing on details rather than feelings. The worst part was not the cages, it was the cleaning. Someone had time to sweep the dirt, thus like they were making a bed. From a private channel log, the property eventually sold at auction. The buyer had no interest in filming or folklore. He hired a crew to clear brush and remove hazards. The outbuilding came down first, demolished from the outside with machines, boards collapsing inward in a single controlled motion. The buyer later stated, in a brief written response to a county inquiry, that he had not stepped inside before tearing it down. He also noted one detail he could not file under common sense. His dog had refused to go near the structure, bristling and pulling away as if the ground itself carried a scent that did not belong. Archive transition. After the shed was demolished, the hillside looked ordinary again, but responders who reviewed the original photos noticed a repeating mark on the cage hardware, a small dot of white paint placed on 3 different fasteners. No one could explain why the dots were there, or why they appeared in the same position across multiple frames, like a quiet signature left by something that preferred its work unobserved, then erased. The last house in the set sat at the end of a forgotten spur that did not appear on most navigation apps. The main road turned into gravel, the gravel turned into clay, and the clay turned into ruts that carried rainwater like narrow streams. The siding had faded to a uniform gray, bleached by years of sun and softened by years of moisture. No curtains, no porch furniture, no trash pile that suggested a recent visitor. It looked like the kind of place that had been surrendered slowly, one unpaid bill at a time, until it became just another quiet failure on a back ridge. The explorers who chose it expected very little. They were used to empty rooms and collapsed roofs, to the same stale smell of wet insulation and mouse nests. They brought cameras anyway because the least interesting houses sometimes held the most inexplicable details. They arrived in late autumn, just after midday, when the light in the hollows stayed cold and flat. Their vehicle rolled onto a patch of gravel near the yard line, and settled into it with a crunch that felt final. They filmed their arrival the way they always did, not for drama but for documentation. The angle of the parking job, the position of the tires, the landmarks that would help them prove later that they had not imagined a shift in the scene. Inside, the house delivered exactly what they expected at first. Bare floors with long water stains, a fireplace choked with fallen brick, a kitchen that had been stripped down to studs in places, as if someone had started a renovation and then abandoned the idea along with everything else. Closets opened onto nothing, cabinets held only dust. The silence was ordinary until it wasn't. Not because they heard a voice, but because their own sounds stopped behaving normally. Their footsteps seemed to dampen as they moved deeper, as if the house absorbed impact. Their camera mics picked up a faint, steady rustle in the background, like fabric settling on a hanger, even when no one was touching anything. The only object that did not fit was in the largest bedroom. A wardrobe stood against an interior wall, too intact to belong. It was not antique and ornate, not a family heirloom that had survived neglect. It looked practical and recent, with clean lines and hardware that should have squeaked in an abandoned house but did not. Its hinges were oiled, its doors swung open without a sound. Inside, a full row of clothing hung on metal hangers, not thrift store leftovers, not moth-eaten coats from decades ago. New garments tagged and sorted by size, shirts, jeans, a heavy winter jacket, all in neutral colors, all arranged with the kind of neatness seen in retail backrooms and closets where someone still cared about order. Each tag carried a barcode and a brand name, currently sold in regional big box stores. The paper was crisp. The plastic fasteners were unbent. There was no dust on the shoulders of the clothes, no insect droppings at the hemline, no musty smell of storage. One of the explorers leaned close enough to film the tags without touching them, and later described what hit him first. It was like fresh laundry, but there was no dust, no insects. Like these had never been outside a store. From an interview transcript on the back wall of the wardrobe, someone had taped a single note on lined paper. The handwriting was blocky, deliberate, and positioned at eye level, like a warning placed for someone who would open the doors and hesitate. Do not touch. It was not written like a joke. There was no added symbol, no flourish, no attempt at intimidation. The ink looked recent enough that it had not bled into the paper fibers. The explorers did what people do when something feels staged for them personally. They backed away. They widened their sweep of the bedroom, checking corners, the closet, the space behind the door, trying to prove to themselves that the wardrobe was just an odd leftover from a recent squatter. They found nothing else recent, no food wrappers, no bedding, no body heat, no smell of sweat or smoke that would suggest a living person. The wardrobe remained the only clean thing in a house built from rot. They completed a quick sweep of the remaining rooms with less patience than before. Their footage showed their lights moving faster, their pauses shortening, their attention sliding away from curiosity and toward exit routes. When they returned to the bedroom for one last look, the clothes had not moved. The note had not curled or fallen. The hangers did not sway, but the sensation of being observed sharpened, as if the house did not like indecision. They left. Outside, the air felt louder than it should have. Wind in bare branches, a distant dog bark, the gravel under their boots grinding too sharply. They moved toward their vehicle with the relief of people stepping out of a confined space. That relief lasted only until one of them stopped and stared at the tires. The car was not where they had left it. It was still on the same patch of gravel, still intact, still locked, but its angle had changed. On their arrival footage, it had been parked parallel to the front of the house, positioned for an easy, straight-out departure. Now it was slightly rotated toward the road, as if someone had nudged it into a better line of escape. The displacement was small, less than a foot, but unmistakable. The tire impressions no longer matched the grooves in the damp gravel left from arrival. Fresh scuffs cut across the old marks at a shallow angle, like a careful push rather than a sloppy roll. They checked for the obvious explanation first. They looked for footprints between the house and the vehicle. There were none. The gravel held their own prints clearly, but nothing else. They listened to their audio, expecting to hear a crunch, a scrape, the sound of a hand on metal. There was no such moment. One of them recorded a short voice memo with the shaky precision of someone trying to build a record that could survive disbelief. The car is turned toward the road. We did not move it. There are no prints, and the dirt does not line up with the way we parked. From a voice memo recorded on site. They checked the yard camera they had left running. The footage showed the car sitting still in the gray daylight, the house behind it like a hollow shell. Then, for a brief instant, the image stuttered. The timestamp jumped forward and corrected itself. In the span between frames, the car's rear tire shifted position by a fraction. It did not move the way a vehicle moved when someone got in and started it. There was no suspension bounce, no change in reflections, no door opening. It moved the way something moved when pushed slowly and evenly, and in a single frame, a narrow shadow crossed the rear bumper, too tall to be a small animal, too thin to match any of the explorers. It slid past with a smoothness that suggested deliberate care, like a person moving in socks on a clean floor. The explorers did not go back inside. They did not touch the wardrobe. They drove until cell service returned and reported what happened in the language that would bring a response. Potential trespass, possible tampering with a vehicle, unexplained movement on camera. A deputy met them later that afternoon at the nearest paved turnout. The report was brief and practical, the kind of writing that refused to inflate a situation it could not explain. Explorers reported perceived vehicle displacement. Physical evidence of minor shift in tire position observed. No signs of forced entry or tampering with locks. From a patrol note, the deputy also noted the part that would matter to anyone reading the file months later. There were no other tire tracks at the property, no approach marks, no turnaround, no indication of another vehicle entering the yard. The only tracks were the explorers' arrival ruts and the faint angled scuffs that suggested the car had been moved without an engine. A follow-up inspection took place days later. The wardrobe was still there. The clothing still hung inside. The note remained taped to the back wall. The deputy did not remove anything. He photographed the tags and the warning and left the doors as he found them. When the property changed hands months afterward, the new owner entered the house with a contractor and a flashlight, expecting to clear debris and begin repairs. In the bedroom, the wardrobe stood in the same place, but the interior was empty. No clothes, no hangers, no note. Only faint outlines in dust suggested that garments had once hung there in neat rows, and a clean rectangle on the back wall marked where tape had once been pressed hard enough to keep paper flat. The contractor reported something else that did not appear in any official record, a subtle change in the gravel outside, as if the vehicle that day had not been nudged toward the road for escape, but positioned like a piece on a board, turned to face the direction someone wanted it to go. Archive closing. Abandoned houses in the Appalachians come with histories of debt, storms, and quiet collapse. Sometimes they also come with signs of recent order inside long decayed rooms, as if someone maintained a private routine there. The explorers who walked into these 9 locations did not always find blood on walls or names carved into beams. More often, they found something that felt worse. The sense that someone had just been there or was still there, arranging the scene for them. If any of these cases stayed with you, share which one will make you think twice the next time you pass a dead farmhouse on a back road. And if you want the next file we unearth from the dark spaces between maps and memory, subscribe to Black Pine Archives.